Thanks. This is just, thank you. There's been so many great papers and good conversations, so thank you to the organizers for doing this. It's just been a lot of fun. My first time here, and I apologize for it being the first time. I just submitted a book like a day and a half ago, so I didn't know what else to talk about. So I'm going to give you either a small bit of a larger argument or a small bit of an even smaller argument. So I'll let you decide which of those options it is. So part of what I'm doing in this project is trying to figure out what I think is more nefarious than the Cartesian, Baconian, what I call a philosophical platform for capitalism. More nefarious than that is a Kantian, Hegelian philosophical platform for capitalism. Why is that the case? Because I think that they elaborate with Descartes and Bacon. You really have an inside-outside dynamic. So you have an ontology of separation. This is Carolyn Merchant's phrases. With Kant and Hegel, you really shift to a more sophisticated inside-outside dialectic. This is a feedback between what I call interaction. This comes from Karen Barat at Santa Cruz, and extra action. So this is really Hegel's elaboration of Kant's transcendental ego. And I'll talk about that just for a couple of minutes. I can see the eyes watering over on this, about some of the technical stuff of this, and I'm happy to answer questions. So obviously what I'm trying to do is trying to think, like a lot of people, trying to think some of the philosophical mechanics for extraction, where they come from, and how they've changed really over the long derail 500 years of capitalism. And again, lots of people are doing this. Sandra Mazadra is doing this. Lots of people. And the place in Mariko was complaining about the lack of references to Marx. The place in Marx to look at some of the different extractive operations is really in Volume 3 of Capital. Most more than Capital Volume 1, but I'm happy to talk about that later. So very quickly, I mean, some of the more contracts, rents, etc., elaborated more specifically in Volume 3. As some of you know, I'll just talk a little bit about the transcendental ego in Kant, and then talk about the shift to Hegel, because I think that's crucial for what I'm doing, which is to try to show how China became the holder of 32% of global GDP in 1830 to 5% of global GDP in 1880. How did that happen? It's just an amazing historical transformation. And I think part of the philosophical explanation for that can be found in the shift from Kant to Hegel. Okay, let's see if you buy any of this. Okay, some of you know that Kant is writing against British empiricism. The empirical world, the outside, is chaotic and messy. This is in the first critique, and therefore it has to be organized. There has to be an operating system, is what I call, for organizing the chaos. This is, I mean, he's obviously battling with Hume, the chaos of the outside. Now, of course, Descartes and Bacon gave us ways to map it. Really what Kant is trying to do is set up a correlation, a much more precise algorithmic relationship between human intelligence and everything else that's outside of that. And the difference between Descartes and Bacon and Kant and Hegel is, for Kant and Hegel, humans are both inside and outside. Humans, I'm sorry, I mean white bourgeois Europeans. Yeah, big mistake there. That's the real difference with Descartes. So with Hegel, humans are both part of what Kant calls nature, but Hegel doesn't really believe that. So they're both in it and out of it. And this is where I think, again, as a philosophical platform for capitalism, it's overwhelmingly nefarious. Okay. So for Kant, mind is, humans both are inside and outside the external world. Okay? The thing for him is to show that there's never going to be a transcendence of the local, of the empirical, of culture and customs. But there has to be a constant struggle to rise above that. And the means to do that is, of course, through the categories, understanding, prehension, etc. This is right from the critique of pure reason. So, so what he's trying to do is to establish, through a feedback loop between outside and inside. Inside is, again, the internal workings of white male bourgeois philosophers. How the technical process of cognizance can best map onto that outside. That's all I can say about that. I can see that that's too abstract. I'm happy to talk about it later, happy to forget about it. Hegel says, so Kant does separate, he separates an inside, a noumena from a phenomena. He separates an inside from an outside, a transcendental ego from an empirical one. The humans have both. That's really, really important. Hegel takes that and he basically says, this is too formalistic. Now this is, some of you know the Marx critique of this, so you might not like this. Hegel's critique, and some of you studying undergraduate philosophy will know this immediately. Hegel's critique of Kant is this is too dry and formalistic, where Kant is really trying to set up this security wall between knowledge and experience, between consciousness and everything else that's outside of it. Things that are always trying to impinge on consciousness, okay? And Hegel says what we have to really do is we have to create a dynamism, a feedback loop between the transcendental and the empirical. Therefore, the transcendental is going to be more precise. It's going to be an operating system that constantly upgrades. So Hegel says, in the example from the phenomenology of spirit, is Napoleon. He thinks that Napoleon really did this. Napoleon is willing to get his hands dirty in the empirical, the messiness, and therefore that can create more sophisticated categories, of transcendental categories, that then can correlate more precisely to the external world and capture it, in Hegel's phrase. Hegel says to plant a flag, plant your flag in all these areas where consciousness can more precisely capture the world. Okay. Now, in all this stuff, and again, the thing Marx is going to, so I call this extra action. Hegel says first there's extra action on something that is perceived to be outside it, and then the body will interact with that outside, and then it will feed back into an extra action. You're hating this, sir. It will feed back into a consciousness. So for Hegel, there's a dialectic, I call it, between intra-action and extra action. And obviously for Hegel, again, as a platform for capitalism, this is to optimalize the operations of extraction. So we have extra action, intra-action, there's no separation between reified beings, okay? Hegel thinks that this is actually right. There's no subsection. There's this flux of becoming. So there's interaction, there's extra action, then there's extraction. Okay, how does this relate to the overthrowing of the sinocentric trading area? How much time do I have left, Gert? You weren't even looking, so you...
Yeah, probably like 6, 7.
Yeah.
6, 7 minutes, all right, 6, 7 minutes, great, okay. White narcos, they are the original bad hombres. White guy drug dealers made, not planetary capitalism, they made capitalism planetary. How did they do that? Because the East India Company had a very sophisticated mechanism similar to the extra action, intra-action dynamic in Hegel in mapping, identifying commodity lines, and the thing to do is mapping human bodies. So what they did, the East India Company, Kant, should have said this before, Kant obviously is one of the first scientific races in the geography. What he does is he's using the powers of the mind to identify the different ways in which human beings are raced. They have specific powers, they have specific properties. Hegel does that too, despite what the post-colonial reading of Hegel. Hegel is very much a scientific racist. The only difference is that Hegel is really committed to race war. He thinks the scientific racism isn't real science until it gets on the ground and starts to interact, literally have wrestling matches with non-white humans. This is Ferreira de Silva's reading of Hegel, if anyone knows that, toward a global idea of race, the great treasure for the last 20 years in critical theory, in my opinion. Okay, white narcos made planetary capitalism. For the first time, the East India Company affiliated drug dealers used scientific racism, okay? So that means they identified what they called brown bodies. Those are coolies, South Asian and Chinese laborers, poppy production areas in Bengal, and what they called high yellow consumer areas in China. They identified this, they mapped this. They built on the experience, okay, of what the Dutch had tried to do. Also, there have been Farsi and other kinds of drug dealers to China. This is completely systematized. Now, they constructed a global commodity chain with, I talk about there are 4 parts of this global commodity chain. 4 parts, the beginnings of planetary capitalism. One is the clipper ship. The second are what I call Chinese captives, coolie captives. The third is contraband. Drugs are illegal in all these areas. Not just drugs, opium, weapons as well. The first military-industrial complex happens at this time, which is another reason China comes down from 31% to 5%. So the clipper ship, coolie captive, contraband, capital network, investors in London, ships building in New England and Baltimore, a lot of them former slave ships. You have the coolie captives, the ones that are taking the ships from Calcutta, sometimes from Turkey, to Guangzhou, and then later to San Francisco. Because remember, opium becomes a global commodity at this time. So that's the circuit that, in some sense, and what I'm arguing in this book, is a perfection of this interaction, extraction dialectic. Okay, one last thing, Kirk, do I have any more time? Should I shut up? Be honest,
No,
Kirk.
yeah.
Be honest.
3 minutes.
Okay.
4 minutes.
All right. Okay. Brown and yellow coolies are, this is very similar to the discourse about African slavery. It's right in Hegel. This comes right from the lectures on the philosophy of history. They're racially built for certain kinds of labor. The good thing for your American capital is to set up a system where they can benefit from that, where the world spirit can touch them, and really, Marx calls this Lazarus layers, and really bring them back from the dead because they were nothing before your American capital came. We can help them by giving them jobs, wage labor. Chinese, on the other hand, especially upper class Chinese, they're the consumer market. The yellow means, you all know what jaune means, right? Jaundice means decayed, decadent. So they identified a consumer market for this product. They identified people that were going to be able to grow it for free, okay, and under British colonialism. They identified people that were literally going to take the ships there. So all these kind of things, and then of course they had to have investor capital. Also what this did, it didn't only take down the Sino-centric trading area, it opened up vast tracts of nature in the Americas. Remember the coolie went to building the railroads here. The coolie captives took over for freed slaves in the Americas. They literally took over for them. So again, this is making the Atlantocentric circuit completely global, I would say. Kirk, give me 1 more minute.
2.
Okay. Now the thing, some people the clipper, coolie, contraband, capital network continued working after the so-called shift to fossil fuels. So the carbon, Jason's written very well on this. It's a ruse to say steamships end. The other thing, that's not, clipper ships, the technology was so sophisticated, or the relationship between interaction and extra-action. You apply knowledge to things in the world and then constantly upgrade it. It was so precise that the clipper ships were faster than steamships into the 1880s. Contraband drugs, contraband weapons, these happened until the 1880s and the 1890s. The thing that ended this finally in East Asia is that when the Brits and the Americans, FDR's grandfather, Delano, he was the 3rd biggest drug dealer in the world. Warren Delano was a major drug dealer. Why they stopped, what ended the clipper, coolie, contraband, capital network is basically the localization of opium production in Western China mainly, where Chinese subalterns really understood that they could grow it better, and they could grow it in terms of use, not in terms of exchange. They could localize it, they could help out peasants, and they could also help out themselves, because they were smokers themselves. What happened? When Euro-American missionaries saw this happening, the import substitution of Chinese opium for British and American opium, what they did was they launched what I call a third war on drugs. The first war on drugs was war for drugs, was the first opium war. This is Britain waged a major international conflict to liberalize the opium trade. The second war for drugs was the second opium war. The third war for drugs was when, this is the beginnings of Big Pharma. Euro-American missionaries, they were the second generation of white narcos. The first generation were the East India Company affiliated drug dealers and some of the US presidents' grandfathers and great-grandfathers. The second generation were Euro-American missionaries who sold to Chinese because Chinese had taken over the global drug trade, opium trade. What they did was sell them this new generation of opioids, morphine, other kinds of synthetics that were supposed to be injected, not smoked. Smoking was read by Euro-American Protestants as decadent, non-modern, etc. So Euro-American missionaries basically started, anyway, that's a complicated thing, but they're modernizers in the Chinese government. 10 more seconds. They're modernizers in the Chinese government who basically internalized this critique from Euro-America about opium smoking as being connected to foot binding, towards the koto, the kowtow, etc. That had to be overcome if China was going to be modern. The proponents of this were all Euro-American doctors, missionary doctors, and they tried to, and they did succeed in substituting locally grown opium. Because the East India Company, they're out of the market now. These new opioids come from Merck, come from Germany, come from the US, they come from Japanese companies, and it introduces a whole different generation of opioids, 20, 30, 40, 50 times stronger than smoking opium. Thanks for your attention.